Yeah, so we'll keep this short and high impact, but we're basically here to talk about what the farming industry can, does and will do to remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
So our company is called Carbon Capture Scotland. We capture CO2, we use CO2 and remove CO2. So today we use CO2 by manufacturing dry ice. We make about half the UK's dry ice supply. We wholesale it to Nippon Gases. They then retail it to BOC. So Ocado is one of our big customers, or their big customers. Donald Russell, Patisserie Valerie, Bella and Duke, these sort of guys. So that's how we use CO2. So we take CO2 from a biogas plant and turn it into dry ice. So that's what we do today. But we're going to go through a bit more about what we've done in the past and where we're going to in the future, and how this is going to be even more relevant to the particularly the arable side.
Just very quickly, it's a bit about us. Speaking to you, we've got a combined 22 years experience in CO2. CO2 is all we do. Previous businesses, we've moved it, we've captured it, we've used it, as Richard said, and that's continuing. So the main topic that we want to address now is how to decarbonise impossible emissions. So we've had a lot of talk today about impossible emissions in the farming industry. There's impossible emissions in every industry, emissions that cannot be decarbonised by fuel switching or whatever else it might be. Our view, well, what we're doing today, and our view on what can be scaled up in the future, is that agriculture is never mind being part of the problem. Agriculture is actually the building blocks of the solution for how we can tackle these emissions. People talk about future government incentives to encourage carbon capture and all the rest of it. That's not enough by itself. So what we're looking at is actually sectors. Again, this is repeating what others have said today. Sectors working together at all parts of the value chain to decarbonise industry.
Our whole process is commercially independent. We don't rely on any funding from the government to make this commercially viable. We've got a system for capturing CO2 and removing CO2, which requires no incentives from the government at all.
So this is our solution to the problem. Essentially, we call it Project Nexus. Our focus is on capturing biogenic CO2. So that could be CO2 from fermentation, anaerobic digestion, even incineration of biomass. But right now, today, in Scotland, there are 1 million tonnes of CO2 that can be very easily captured. The total figure in the long term is more like 4.5 million. Now, to put that in context, 4.5 million is slightly more than a third of Scotland's large industrial emissions. So if we can capture all of that and remove it, so through various means, that is a huge impact, and we don't even need to look at, that's without even looking at fuel switching and all the rest of it.
So the reason we've got a photograph of a whisky distillery here is we are going to be the end part of the whole carbon capture removal process of this. So right now, the grain, the barley grows in the fields, the CO2 is absorbed into that product, it then gets transported to the distillery, it goes through a masher, fermentation, then it goes through a washback. And what washbacks do is they separate what is inside that product. So if you take a ton of grain, you've got about a third of that CO2, a third of that's ethanol, a third of that's hot ale stroke draft. What happens today is that CO2 then vents off the top of a washback and goes to the atmosphere. Now that CO2, the distilleries don't have to declare that today because that's net zero, so it's absorbed in your fields. It's then vented out the top of the washback, so it's neutral, right? So they're not generating CO2, they're simply breaking the product down, which has already captured the CO2. That lends itself to an opportunity, whereas if you capture that and remove that CO2, you're actually removing that CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's essentially direct air capture. So that's taking CO2 from previous fossil fuel emission sources in the atmosphere, getting soaked in the fields, getting absorbed into the grain, and it gets broken down, and we want to capture that. Our plan is to capture that CO2 and remove it.
Yeah, so this is what Richard just explained very helpfully. This is broken down. There's obviously various different actors across this value chain, but this is a very simple, from a carbon point of view, this is how we see the sort of growing to end use value chain of CO2. So it could be crops, it could be grass, livestock obviously eating the grass. But we see those not as necessarily as a product, but from a carbon point of view, we see that as a carbon capture vehicle. So as Richard said, the CO2 is captured in the crop, the CO2 is captured in the grass. Along the way, that is then used in various ways, and it can then be released. So that release could be fermentation. It could be the anaerobic digestion of farmyard manure, for example. And there's various ways that that's done. We do a lot of it in Scotland. Huge fermentation distilling industry in Scotland. A lot of the biogas industry is growing in Scotland. Lots of that available to us. And then that takes us into what is probably the most underdeveloped part of the value chain, but that's where our primary focus is going to be going forward. There's utilisation, which we do right now. That's probably more of a decarbonising part of the process where we're replacing fossil CO2. But the big thing is removal. So if we're sequestering biogenic CO2, that's being removed from the atmosphere permanently.
So what's holding back on the removal is the Track 2 situation from the Westminster government for helping the Acorn project. So the Acorn project is basically a bunch of big companies like Shell and then a smaller company called Strega and a few others who've got the rights to put CO2 into a redundant oil well field off the coast of St Fergus. That needs money from the government to make it viable. They can't do that on their own. We need that up and running to make this whole thing work, to take the CO2 from your fields, to take it from the distilleries. We can't keep feeding it to a dry ice plant because the dry ice market's only 40,000 tonnes a year, so that's great. We've got that covered, and that helps pay for all the R&D that we've got. But to remove the CO2, we need to go to the next level. So we are working on our own removal site, which will up and running by mid-25. But now we're building sites, capturing CO2 in distilleries, which will hopefully come from your fields. And we are making it very clear to the distilleries that the grain, the product, everything needs to come as local as possible. We've got a really good relationship with White Mackay. I'm glad to say that Cairn has got all their feedstock is coming from a 50-mile radius. For us to be able to talk to the distilleries and capture their CO2 and make them look really good, which is what we want them to do, great for the Scottish whisky industry, we need them to be sourcing local product. So we're flying that flag for you. So that's our current site today. That's in Dumfries and Galloway. We own the assets there. We've rented the land which the assets sit on from a local farmer, and we basically take the CO2 from the back of his AD plant, process it in that kit there to the right-hand side, liquefy it, and then solidify it in the dry ice plant. So that's what pays for us to be here today. We've got a really good team running that. We let them run that themselves. And Ed and I can now concentrate solely on the new venture, which is capturing CO2 for removal.
So that's a great example of CO2 utilisation in practice. All the CO2 we capture there is used to make dry ice. That directly displaces dry ice that would be made with fossil CO2, for example, from ammonia production. So by doing that, it's directly decarbonising. What we're going to be doing is capturing more CO2 off-site and bringing it in there to expand that process. But this is interesting for the future, perhaps more interesting. This is an example of a removal project. So this is, for example, in Invergordon Distillery in Invergordon, White Mackay. Higher capture potential, and all CO2 from there will be for sequestration, so pure removal.
Why are we talking about hydrogen there? If you mix hydrogen with CO2, you get methanol. Methanol is much easier to transport. It's much easier to store. It can be stored in much lower pressure conditions, and it's probably a slightly easier product to use. So that's why we're talking about methanol. If you want green methanol, you need to take biogenic CO2 and mix it with green hydrogen. So that's the link there.
So this is just to make really clear, this is something that is possible. This is something we are doing today. It's something that can be scaled up massively in the future. The technology exists. The customers exist. So we haven't really talked about it too much just yet, but customers for negative emissions, it's generally industrial technology companies like Microsoft and others who are early adopters. There's a market for carbon credits that are generated as a result of negative emissions. Currently, it's an unregulated market. There's a lot of pressure on the government to turn that into a regulated market very soon, a compliance market. There's people are looking at ways to integrate that with the existing compliance market. There's transportation. CO2 can be transported by boat, by road, by rail. As Richard said earlier, there's various CO2 storage options available, and of course in Scotland we have an excellent supply of biogenic CO2. So this is possible now. It simply needs to be scaled up. But I think the point we want to make again and again is that at the very heart of all of this is it's nowhere without the supply of the raw product, which is essentially grain and biomass. So just to give an idea of how this will scale, this is our plans. So we're doing some of these projects now. We're getting to 50,000 tonnes of CO2 removed by the end of the year, and then scaling gradually. The real scale happens when, as we said earlier, the Scottish CO2 or Scottish sequestration projects come on stream. That's going to be a huge game changer, and we need to collectively put pressure on the government, who are actually currently holding up the process to get that moving. It's worth noting all these jobs that go, the jobs availability scales pretty much linearly with the CO2 capacity, and that is all rural jobs. So something that's very important to us, I think important about the message that we're putting across, is that this is very much a way to include the rural economy with this transition to low carbon. It's not all about technology in California or whatever else it might be. This is hands-on jobs, whether it's transporting the CO2, whether it's processing the CO2. This is actually a way. It's actually an opportunity for rural areas to put their hand up for participating in this.
So that number there by 2030 is completely doable. That comes from taking the whisky distilleries on the mainland close to our storage site that we're building today. That's taking the biogas plants as well, which already have some upgraders built on, and there's a few biogas plant owners here which we're already speaking to try to encourage them to separate their CO2 and then liquefy that on site to add to that. But that's doable, and that's all going to come from the farming community. This as well. It will grow to that number through various different biogenic sources. We're talking biomass. We're talking other sources which will make that happen. But that's all from the agricultural industry. Without the agricultural industry, that won't happen. So that is what we will, with this plan, be able to achieve carbon removal by 2040.
So this is just a summary. I told you we'd keep it short. We'll probably want to get to lunch pretty quick, but just to give an idea of some of the people that we're working with right now. Luckily, this idea, this project, has the support of some really good brands, globally recognised brands: Macallan, Glenmorangie, North British, White Mackay, it's people are really putting their hand up to take part in this. What we really want to do is bring together all partners in that value chain. So these guys are the end users of the product of the let's say grain, I think it's going to be something that's much more powerful if everybody involved is participating in it.
So yeah, we're pretty straightforward. We're not sort of mince our words. That's it. That's what we do. So we'll be capturing. We capture CO2 today. We use it today. We are capturing a lot more CO2 this year and for the next 20 years, and we will be putting that away, so it will be out of the atmosphere. And you guys will be a part of that whole process.
Cheers.